Well, good morning to you all. Yesterday, you did raise some. Yes, what I was saying is that yesterday you did raise some very interesting questions, and today we are going to discuss probity in governance. There are various topics under this, a pretty long list, a long agenda. Concept of public service, philosophical basis of governance and probity, information sharing and transparency in government, right to information, codes of ethics, codes of conduct, citizens' charters, work culture, quality of service delivery, utilization of public funds, challenges of corruption. Really, there's nothing left in the world of administration if you could cover all these. However, before I take up this subject, what I intend to do, I share with you that we'll cover everything except the issue of utilization of funds and corruption today. That will be taken up tomorrow because that subject is too vast, too complex, and therefore would merit a session. You see, we discussed yesterday the lessons of the World War II. That is, not really the lessons of World War II, but the post-World War II development experience of all countries. There are several issues, several factors. I'd like to add one. The last one, successful diplomacy is generally more about managing problems than solving them overnight. This is an interesting lesson that successful diplomacy or diplomacy in general is really about managing problems, not solving them outright. Take for instance the Palestinian problem. It has been there since the birth of Israel, the Kashmir problem. And look at the world. The diplomacy has been primarily an effort to manage the problems and to avoid war. Henry Kissinger holds this view. He said, and I quote, "The task of a statesman is to construct a balance of fear among great powers as part of the maintenance of an orderly international system, that which not necessarily just or fair was accepted by the principal players as legitimate." Henry Kissinger, in his recent book, The World Order, has propounded this doctrine that instead of balance of power doctrine, which really governed the international relations till World War II, it is now the balance of fear. You see? And the task of a statesman is to construct a balance of fear among great powers, which will create a mindset not willing to go for war, and therefore a nuclear war will be avoided if such a system is constructed. That system may not be just or fair, but it is legitimate. Now you see, this point is extremely important, the issue of legitimacy. Now, in Kashmir, for example, after Shimla Agreement, what was ceasefire line has been converted into line of control. Line of control gives what you call legitimacy. And during the Kargil war, Kargil conflict, war is too big an expression. In the Kargil conflict, the Pakistan violated that Lakshman Rekha, line of control, and captured some posts on our side of the line of control. The United States intervened. Bill Clinton spoke to Pakistani Prime Minister that you must withdraw, and it worked. Of course, our troops moved ahead and managed to recapture, but the advice of Bill Clinton to Pakistan government was that once you agreed to line of control, it has acquired a certain legitimacy, and it is not within our powers to violate the sanctity of line of control. So this is the last lesson, you can say, of international experience, development and political after World War II. Now you come to our main topic, which is probity, civil service values and ethics in public administration. What is probity? The Oxford Dictionary meaning of probity is uprightness, integrity, and incorruptibility. In a broader sense, it includes a whole range of norms of private and public behavior, which, broadly speaking, generally remain in the realm of aspirations, lofty objects, might not be realizable on a significant scale. But before you do so, let us look at all these subjects that I mentioned to you. What I intend to do is to break them into three categories. The first subject is public service and probity, its philosophical basis, code of ethics and conduct, and work culture. Second part is transparency and right to information, quality of service, delivery, and citizens' charter. Okay. Now, if you look at public service delivery, what does it really mean? The word service, you see, has different meaning. It is not nokri. In India, normally service means nokri. But in English language, it has a different meaning. It is based on provision of some public need. Service provides some answers to public need. Okay? Service doesn't mean job. You normally say, मैं कुछ job करता हूँ. It is not job. Service basically means in the government that you are involved in the provision of some public need. And public service in this sense has a wide and expanding definition, as it is based on public perception of their need and the need for services. Now this public perception of the need for services varies from time to time. You see, it may expand, as I mentioned in the previous lecture. What was considered unimportant 20 years back would be very important today. You see, take for instance, safe drinking water. Earlier, people would drink water at railway stations from the taps which are provided on the platform or what you have in the train. I have drank it throughout my life. This bottled water, this mineral water, it came in the 80s as a part of the global effort to what is called commodification of daily necessities of life. Water was something we all drank, municipal tap water. Now, what has happened as a consequence of this commodification is that municipal authorities feel that at any case, most people will buy bottled water. So why bother much about, what you call good quality of water that the municipal system should provide. It's not that important. Now, this means that we have a set of priorities which keeps on changing from time to time. But nevertheless, the report of the Health Ministry shows that nearly 70% of diseases, you see, is waterborne. Therefore, safe water is a high priority matter, whether people go for bottled water or mineral water or whatever. Even then, it is the primary responsibility of the municipal authorities to provide, to supply safe drinking water. So, but public service means that this is to be provided by public authority. The definition of a public authority includes various bodies. It could be government, it could be municipality. In other words, any authority which is acting under a state law. A state statute is most important. That authority is public, whose functions are regulated under a state law. Now, this brings me to a larger philosophical issue. What is the basis of power? What is the basis of state power? You could certainly say that basis of state power is the people's consent. You know, in a democracy, it is the opinion of the people, their views, which are important. But the person who delivers the service, whether he is an official, a civil servant, or a municipal official, whatever, he is an individual. Okay? And he is exercising certain powers conferred on him by the law. And he is an individual. So if we ask him that do this, do that, etc., we may provide a code of conduct. It may be even, as it is in India, it may be in a statutory obligation. It is a statutory obligation on the part of the official to deliver the service. Nevertheless, there are certain basic aspects of exercise of power. I go back to Bertrand Russell. I mentioned to you yesterday that Russell's essay, his book on power, title of the book is Power, was a must-read during our times. He also wrote some brilliant essays, one of which I could read last night, in his book, Roads to Freedom. Here, he deals with civil service and how power is exercisable by this civil service and what are the limitations, what are the constraints. Very interesting. By the way, Russell's essays are really brilliant, and it may be useful for you to follow his style for your essay paper. Russell wrote that human beings normally are not very prone to read essays. However, the art of essay writing is that your first few sentences must be interesting. It must catch the attention of the examiner. And then the last sentence of your essay must be equally arresting, so that the first few sentences in your essay will create interest in the mind of the examiner to go through your essay. Okay? And then having read it towards the end, he would not like to leave with a sense of boredom or a sense of fatigue. If he finds that your conclusion is nicely written, he would get deeply impressed, and that will decide the marks that you would get for your essay. Essay writing is an art. Essentially, it is an art. It is to attract the mind of the examiner to the subject and your trend of thinking, your line of thinking. But it begins with an interesting statement. Why I'm saying this is because Russell begins his every essay with a deeply thought-provoking sentence. Just listen to me. Russell wrote, and I quote, "Respect for liberty of others is not a natural impulse with most men." Respect for liberty of others is not a natural impulse with most men. Envy and love of power lead ordinary human nature to find pleasure in interferences with the lives of others. What does it mean? Human beings, by and large, are deeply concerned about their own liberties. But when it comes to liberties of others, we are not that much, seriously concerned. Second, envy is natural. Love is also a natural impulse. These two together create a mindset that finds pleasure in interfering with the lives of others. This is an extremely philosophical but an accurate description of human psyche. So a man who exercises power as any official, high or low, operates under this kind of a constraint. The second point he made was, I quote, "The love of power is an impulse which, though innate in very ambitious men, is chiefly promoted as a rule by the actual exercise of power." This is very interesting. The love of power is naturally an impulse, but men who are ambitious, women who are ambitious, they find it quite convenient to exercise that power. They enjoy the exercise of power. And this love of power is the consequence of actual exercise of power. Now, if you start exercising power, you start enjoying it. You may not know it, but at the heart of your heart, you will enjoy it. And in the process, one gets somewhat, what should I say, addicted to power. So that's why the expression power drunk, is basically derived from manifestation of this psychology. Russell went on to say, "I cannot think that it would be wholly absent, and those in whom it would exist would often be men of unusual energy and executive capacity." You get my point? It is an extremely loaded sentence. What he says is that this quality, that is the impulse to exercise power over others and enjoy it in the process, is very common. Not among common people, Aam Aadmi. It is generally seen in the behavior of people who are endowed with unusual energy, intellect, and executive capacity. So you see here, Russell says that power is a natural part of human instinct. Enjoyment of power is also natural. But at the same time, there is a danger of men with unusual energy, intelligence, and executive capacity finding great pleasure in exceeding the powers, in misuse of powers. Corruption, misuse of power are rooted in this particular psychology. Last point that Russell makes is very interesting. He said, and apart from love of power, there is the love of power over other individuals. This power over other individuals is also a kind of mental faculty, I would say, but it requires control. Now, to control it, you need to have a philosophy to restrain yourself, self-controlled. Here, the value systems would be important. When I know that I have the power and I can misuse it, but I will not do it, that makes what you call an ethical man, a man who knows his limitations. He also knows his powers. Vivekananda made a highly perceptive comment about honesty. He said, a beggar will be always honest because he has nothing to give to anybody. He has to depend on others. But I will call a man honest when he has the intelligence, he has the power, but he doesn't misuse it for his own selfish ends. So therefore, honesty and exercise of power in whatever form are somewhat interrelated. Russell also talks about the civil service. What I'm trying to cover here is the philosophical basis of probity. That is one of the subjects included in this chapter. An official, here a high official, has already reached a certain level. He has the experience behind him. And how does he look at the society? When you become a high-ranking officer, your outlook changes. You may not be aware of that, but your face will show. Your body language will show. Your words will show. Russell, a great scientist, a philosopher, has observed it. And his observations are extremely relevant. I quote, given an official caste, mark the use of the word caste by Russell, an Englishman. Given an official caste, however selected, there are bound to be a set of men whose whole instincts will drive them towards tyranny. Tyranny means tyranny. Tyrany. Tyranny means tyrant. He'll be a kind of a tyrant, a man who will misuse power, use his might to suppress others. Okay, I read again. Given an official caste, however selected they are, there are bound to be a set of men whose whole instincts will drive them towards tyranny. Together with their natural love for power, they will have a rooted conviction, visible now in the higher ranks of the civil service, that they alone know enough to be able to judge what is for the good of the community. Like all men who administer a system, they will come to feel the system sacrosanct. This is extremely important. But Russell says that whatever may be the method of selection, on the basis of merit or whatever, the natural love for power and position is bound to create a mindset that is visible now in the higher ranks of the civil service, that they know everything, and they know what is good for the country, what is good for the Aam Aadmi, what is good for the nation, etc. Others really don't know, because others don't have access to the information. You have all the records, you have all the information, secret, confidential, and what is there in the public domain. So it creates a kind of a mindset that all others don't know anything, I know everything, we know everything, etc. Like all men who administer a system, they will come to feel the system itself sacrosanct. In other words, system is everything, because I am identified with the system. My interest is to see that the system moves on, gets greater strength, because with the system gaining strength, I also gain strength. Now, this psychology is, you can say, seems to work in every bureaucratic system in the world. Not in some degrees, it may be more in some, it may be less in some, but this perception remains that we are the people on the ground, we are the people who run this country, therefore we know how better it should be run. This is what is called the foundation of insensitivity of the bureaucracy. When you talk about bureaucracy being insensitive, what really you have in mind is this kind of mindset. The other point that Russell made, which really follows from the earlier proposition that we have just discussed, what is the role of the state? How do you look at the state? Is it the end of everything? Is it the final institution that mankind has been able to develop to attain progress? There is nothing final in the world. Coming to think of it, till the 20th century, only 4% of the geographical area of the world was under some states. Only 4%, mind you. Only 4% of the geographical surface of the world was under a regular nation-state system. The whole of Africa, for example, was partitioned. So if you look at the map of Africa, you find interesting straight lines dividing Sudan and Egypt. Who had drawn that line? The cartographers had drawn the line because imperial powers decided to what is called partition, and as a kind of a landed property, and it was partitioned. So therefore the maps look ridiculous to me. The African maps look ridiculous. Look at Sierra Leone, look at Nigeria, look at the map of Sudan, even Egypt. I once traveled from Cairo to Alexandria, and I asked this question to the Egyptian officers: how come your boundaries are so straightforward? He said, it is not our boundaries, sir. It is all laid down by these Brits, and we are merely following it. We find it is easy to maintain, If it is a straight line border, then you don't have much of a problem. So we have not thought much of, changing it. So the concept of state is what we must try to understand, because concept of state is nothing but an instrument of exercise of certain powers, right? By whom, for whom are related issues. Okay, but state is a state. So Russell said, and I quote, "The glorification of the state and the doctrine that it is the duty of every citizen to serve the state are radically against progress and against liberty." It is a revolutionary idea. The glorification of the state and the doctrine that it is the duty of every citizen to serve the state are radically against progress and against liberty. It is not the state, but the community, the worldwide community of all human beings, present and future, that we ought to serve, unquote. To an Indian, the first part of the statement may appear to be a little confusing, isn't it? Because glorification of the state, glorification of Bharat Mata, is implicit in the idea of India as a state. But what Russell says is its application to the whole world. Now look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a state. It's a monarchy, but it is a state. Now, if every citizen feels that kind of commitment to a state, regardless of its nature or regardless of its composition, you have a situation where you are submitting yourself to an unjust, irrational, unscientific order, which is not designed to serve the long-term interests of other people. So, dictatorships, totalitarian systems are also states, and therefore, while glorifying the state, it is the character of the state which is to be glorified. If it is a modern state, if it is a democratic state, if it is a welfare state. So these are the characteristics which really determine the degree of loyalty that one should have to a particular state. Just look back to recent history. The people of East Pakistan was a part of a state. They were the majority. But the West Pakistanis felt that majority should not be the basis of elections. So they devised all kinds of, I should say laws, systems, which enabled perpetuation of dominance of the minority over the majority. The other issue they raised was foreign exchange primarily was being earned from exports from Eastern Pakistan, which included tea and jute, whereas the West Pakistan was not getting much export, revenues, whatever. So therefore, they should get a proportionate share of the foreign exchange and investment. This was ignored, rejected outright. So when the elections were held in the year 1971, it was found that Awami League, a party based in East Pakistan, with the support of some dissidents in Sindh and Balochistan, commanded majority in the Pakistani Constituent Assembly. So it was natural that the leader of the party commanding majority should be invited to form the government. But this was not to the liking of the leader, Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. So it led to a constitutional crisis. And what happened later on is a part of history. What I'm trying to say is that state as such need not be glorified. It is the nature of the state that is important. And this is the point that Russell made, that it is not the state but the community. In other words, he's talking about freedom, he's talking about progress, he's talking about peace, he's talking about empowerment, economic, social, as well as cultural. Therefore, while we deal with the issue of probity, we must bear in mind the institutional constraints on functioning of states. Now, just to give an example, that these constraints are important. One such constraint I have in mind, I'd like to share with you. See, the cost of elections in a democracy and the role of donations from high and mighty, rich and famous. Look at United Kingdom, the model of democracy. You had a few years back the problem of what was known as cash for honor scam. In UK, it was a scandal. If you donate 100,000 or whatever, a certain amount, I will elevate you to the House of Lords. You become Lord so-and-so. If you pay 50,000 or some lesser amount, you'll be made a knight of the realm. What is called knight commander of the British Empire. So, since these honors are bestowed on individuals on the recommendations of the Prime Minister, and the Queen really, or the Crown, has not much of a choice, therefore it became a scam. You think of the United States, there has been always a problem of who funds elections in America, who funds the Democratic Party, who funds the Republican Party. Do you remember the case of an Indian businessman, a businessman of Indian origin, who donated a lot of money to the election campaign? And then there was an arrangement that he would be honored by India. It's a unique interlocking kind of a system. So this gentleman was conferred Padma Vibhushan or something. You see, later on it was found that this particular businessman was involved in some irregularities in India as well as in US. But by the time, the office of the presidency, it had changed. Point I'm trying to make is that these are institutional constraints on practice of probity in the country, even in a democratic system. So, these subjects like probity, public service delivery, etc., these are somewhat interrelated and pretty complex. Result is that public administration, public policy making and implementation, public service delivery are now subjects of research and study at various institutions in the West and in developing countries and developed countries. I mentioned about Kennedy School of Government, Harvard School of Government, and in Singapore we have the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Public Policy, which is currently headed by Kishore Mahbubani. He is the Dean of Lee Kuan Yew Center for Public Policy. And here in Delhi you have the O.P. Jindal University and a number of private universities. They have also started working on public policy. The important thing, therefore, is that we have to understand and relate public service to public interest, and in doing so, there has to be a continuous research, study, and interaction with the public to develop the concept of public interest, so that it is not confused with private, sectional, communal, or even local interest. So, state as the provider of public service is really a community-driven organization. It has to be a community-driven organization aiming at the highest good for the greatest number of people, and the end of the state, therefore, Aristotle said quite frankly, is good life. Aristotle's dictum that a political society exists for the sake of noble actions, not mere companionship, form the theoretical basis of expanding concept of public interest. Let us not forget that maintenance of public order and judicial system are extremely important for development of economy, for any kind of development. Why? Because without a system, a judicial system that enforces expeditious settlement of disputes, no economic progress is possible. This point was made by Adam Smith, that ultimately it is the systemic ability to enforce contracts quickly that creates confidence in the business. When you talk about the ease of doing business in India, what we have in mind is that when industries investments flow in, there will be definitely certain cases of disputes. And the dispute settlement mechanism has to be efficient, transparent, honest, and more importantly, should be expeditious. Keeping in view, the Government of India has amended the Arbitration Act. I have circulated this news item. The main objective is to remove this constraint. And this is the ideological basis of a functioning state, an efficient state that will promote development. And therefore, this talk of minimum government and maximum governance, frankly, suggests one thing: build more efficient systems. Minimum government doesn't mean that government withdraws and leave the matters to individuals to settle. No. Minimum government really means efficient instruments of government, and minimum means the time taken to resolve a matter, to take a decision, has to be minimum. That is the point, that the time taken to resolve a dispute, or say to take an investment decision, to provide infrastructural support, to say to provide land, to provide electricity, for example, electricity connection. And these are the things which should be done with minimum of hassles and at the earliest. So this is what is meant by minimum government and maximum governance. Maximum governance is the output. Maximum governance is the output of public service, right? By this logic, Aristotle held, interestingly, long back, and I quote, "A government is good when it aims at the good of the whole community, bad when it cares only for itself." The colonial government in India was of the second type. It basically cares for itself. It wanted to perpetuate the rule of the British. So from this it follows that if lawmakers or the civil servants seek to give themselves a very high compensation unrelated to the general conditions of the people, it would be a case failing to pass the test of either probity, public service, or public interest. I read recently a newspaper item that a committee of a particular state decided to give the MLAs a salary of a small amount of 3,20,000 rupees per month. Now, this particular recommendation of a committee is a case of pure and simple self-help. That is, you give to yourselves a salary without inviting public opinion, without consulting other stakeholders. This is a case which will not pass the test of either public interest or public service or probity. So the code of ethics or the code of conduct of all public servants is founded on this perception: orderly and proper governance, education of the general public, and respect for law, even in small things, and justice in law and administration are imperative. So these thoughts of Aristotle hold good even today. In other words, those who run the system should not benefit from the system in a manner that looks non-transparent, unfair, and therefore unjustified. Now, this view of the state as an institution essential for orderly management of the society for progress was by and large accepted. But when I say state, it is a modern state. Modern state that is accountable to the people, that takes care of the interests of the taxpayers, that formulates policy for expanding opportunities for development for the people, is what is accepted. If a state seeks to achieve objects contrary to this, it is not a benign state. It is not what you call a progressive state. Karl Marx did not agree with this perception of state. In Das Kapital, Marx argued, after enormous study, that the history of the hitherto existing societies is a history of class struggles. He argued that the state that existed in Europe in the early 19th century was basically run by the bourgeoisie, the people who owned capital, and basically in their own interest to exploit the working class, the proletariat. Now, it is interesting to note that this view was widely accepted in the colonial world, in the countries which were dominated by foreign powers. They perceived in a way that the rule was basically to perpetuate the interests of the rulers, the colonial powers. Nevertheless, after we became free, and when you made a constitution, if you see the debates of the Constituent Assembly, there are interesting thoughts on what should be the character of the Indian state. There was a general consensus that it would be a republic, universal adult franchise based. However, when it came to decentralization of powers, Ambedkar had a different opinion. Ambedkar felt that village panchayats are instruments for perpetuating the oppression of the Dalits. That was his view, that village panchayats are really instruments of exploitation. But he found merit in the state taking up a welfare agenda and therefore supported state socialism necessary for progress. So therefore he supported Pandit Nehru's idea of socialistic pattern of society, and that the state should have a role in eradication of poverty, in bringing about justice, in carrying out land reforms, in carrying out labor reforms, in protecting the rights of plantation labor, etc. Later, Ambedkar moved towards this kind of an idea, a liberal social welfare state with planning and focus on industrialization and using state to ensure social justice. Now you see here that Gandhiji was on a different plane altogether. He didn't like a large, strong, powerful state. He favored, as you all know, Gram Swaraj, and he was clear on one point, that the village or the village cluster must evolve as self-governing, economically self-reliant, producing enough for all inhabitants, and self-fulfilling as a civilization, capable of nourishing the time-honored Indian value systems. So this concept of an all-embracing state, however, has been gaining ground with the advancement of science and technology and its application to economy that needs a strong state to promote what might be called modernization. Such a state, as we are trying to build now, requires a strong class of what you call administrators. The administrative class, interestingly, is supposed to have all the qualities that Aristotle thought cultured gentlemen should possess. They should have the qualities of Plato's guardians, you see, and they must protect, preserve the interest of the community. The demand for good governance based on ethics and an inviolable code of conduct in all democracies is really based on this perception. So I conclude this section with a kind of a statement that ethics is relatable to efficiency. There is a link between ethics and efficiency. Depends on how we interpret efficiency. If the quality of public service has to improve, it has to be delivered in an ethical, transparent and honest manner. Here, you need character. Take for instance, if dispute settlements have to be done expeditiously and in a fair manner, transparent manner, the persons presiding over these arbitration boards or courts or tribunals must have adequate professional knowledge to be able to deal with the matter expeditiously. They must be free from any bias. They must not be involved in this matter, a clear and open mind. The interest is that sooner we dispose the matter, better is for improving the country's environment, economic environment, ability to attract business. Finally, accountability to the public, that what I am deciding is not the final word. All decisions are subject to appeal. But if most of my decisions are not appealed against. I'll get the mental satisfaction that I have done my job, discharged my duties. So this basically is, you can say, a system where the civil servants do not allow state to be hijacked by some elements whose interests are contrary to the general interest of the people. So this role of the civil servant as a kind of guardians, but at the same time they are the people who are implementing the decisions, right? So efficiency in this sense is not possible without adoption of ethical practices. Therefore, this is what we would say inviolable, and there has to be a system with watchdogs, bodies above, to see that the system does not deviate, does not develop aberrations. At the same time, equally important is to create institutions for upgrading the skills of the civil servants. This point is very important. While the watchdog will see that aberrations are avoided, but the state itself will develop facilities for training, for upgradation of skills of the civil servants. Together, it will create a kind of an escalator for efficiency, and the civil servants will move on to the escalator, and things would look much, much better. So we move from one level of efficiency to another higher level of efficiency. So this part explains what you might call the philosophical basis and the code of civil service based thereon. If you have any question on this, I'll be glad to respond.
You said public interest is larger good for highest number.
Pardon me? Yes.
So wouldn't it go against minority interests?
Of course. You see, like this, it is like this, that largest number, greatest good for the greatest number. That's really the proper word used by Jeremy Bentham. Greatest good for the greatest number. And this would certainly include all. You see, there is no category outside the state. All citizens are equal because all are taxpayers. This classification of minorities, etc., these are outside the law. In the sense, outside the basic structure. I'm not correct, certainly, because there is a minority commission. There is a definition of religious and linguistic minorities in the Constitution. There are commissions to deal with their problems. But the basic structure of the Constitution includes the rule of law, equality before law, and equal opportunities for all. Now, if on the assessment of ground reality, it is found that certain groups are not coming up, the Constitution provides measures for providing extra help, to providing extra support, to enable them to come up. There are there are many schemes to help the minorities now. You can access all these. Take for instance, there are schemes to support minority boys and girls to get education. There are loans for starting enterprises, etc. There are specific instruments like corporations which have been created to promote progress among these groups. So it is perfectly compatible with the object of the state. Yes, ma'am.
So, if we are saying that the exercise of state power is derived from the will of the people, given the nature of the state in the modern state. But if majority of the people are status quo, and not very embracing of change. Then, which in many situations you see in India, in many scenarios, even if you have the political will to change certain things, since people are so used to that particular system for so long, it is very difficult to garner that political will to change the entire system. So, people have arguments against subsidies, action. So there are many such status quoist approaches in many areas, which makes it difficult for the state, per se, even if we assume a benevolent state, to change, to lubricate the wheels of change. Essentially, because the will of the people is not coming. So, in that sense, given by this that you can only exercise power derived through the will of the people, should the state be waiting for people, the right time for people to embrace it, or how do you act not dictatorship, not dictator-like, and still ensure change?
Okay, if I have understood you correctly, see, essentially, it is not possible for a state to go for a referendum on every policy. It is not practical. It is not done. Therefore, whenever a particular issue is raised by an interest group, say, if a certain section of entrepreneurs feels that the labor laws in India are much too in favor of the labor, or somewhat in favor of the labor, therefore it acts as a disincentive to grow and expand. There is a contrary view always in a democracy, that the labor rights have evolved over a century, almost over a century, and these are sacrosanct. Right to strike is embodied in the labor laws. If you withdraw this, the labor will be disaffected. So, you will see always there is a pro-changer and a no-changer. What is the public interest part in it? The public interest part, in this particular case, will be to make a compromise. And the state in a democracy is always flexible enough to accommodate the views and interests of others, all groups, and then evolve a policy that may not be wholly acceptable, but it will be largely acceptable to the society. This is the principle which is followed in democracies. On every issue, take the issue of land. The tribal rights over lands and the interest of the mining groups, interest of energy security of the country, okay? Then you have to have a policy that accommodates the tribal's rights, which are embodied in the forest laws, the need for mining, for energy security, and the need for maintaining peace and tranquility. Nothing should be done that creates a law and order problem. So it is always a balancing act. This, in a democratic state, is always involved in a tight rope walking kind of a syndrome. It is unavoidable, especially for a country as large as India. Interestingly, the point you made was really anticipated by Alexis de Tocqueville, I mentioned yesterday. Alexis de Tocqueville said, and I quote, "A multi-party system merely hardens and institutionalizes the existing ethnic and regional divisions." Way back in 1848. I repeat, a multi-party system merely hardens and institutionalizes the existing ethnic and regional divisions in a society that has not reached development. The last part is important, that these problems that you mentioned, of conflicting interests, etc., would always be there when the state is trying to reach a higher level of economic and social development. Multi-party system hardens that, particularly at this stage when we are trying to achieve progress. Later, this gets resolved. It is also useful to remember what Tocqueville said. Democracy evolved in the West as the organic outgrowth of development. A structured division of the population into peacefully competing interest groups was necessary if tyranny and anarchy were to be avoided. Please note this expression, peacefully competing interest groups. You have raised the issue of interest groups, but it has to be peacefully competing interest groups. If you get hold of this book of Tocqueville, start going through it, you will understand US. And the issues which really characterized economic, social and political growth of USA. Just look at today how well the US has been able to accommodate diverse ethnic groups from all over the world, and how fully integrated Arabs. It was quite amusing for me to observe that the Indians in US are fiercely loyal to US. They're so loyal, they're more loyal than the Americans. They won't utter a word of criticism against the American leadership. They would not like to discuss, even if you raise the issue that there are certain things in US which are not good, they would try to defend. Recently I met one such person, and I mentioned about the killing spree in US. You have seen that one black man goes and shoots down, one white man goes and shoots down. I said, what is all this? It doesn't happen in our country. You know, we have 125 crores of people. Yes, there are here and there some thing, but we seem to be more civilized. He really flared up. He did not like to hear this. Now, this is because the US system creates conditions helping people to integrate and to identify themselves with the aspirations of the country. This is the positive side of that. So, when you think of public interest, you must remember the objective of a democracy is best served when you have peacefully competing interest groups looking for space in the policies and in the decision-making structure, right? Any other thought? No. We now come to the issue of work culture. Work culture of civil service follows from its ethics, service rules, code of conduct, which define the duties of civil servants and how these duties are to be discharged, rather in too many details because of the rule maker's penchant for not leaving any scope for deviation. Now this is a Protestant kind of a mindset that we inherited from the British. When you prepare the code of conduct, anything, we would not like to leave any scope for any deviation. It is actually a code for a priest or a man who is aspiring to be a priest. Thou shalt not do this, shall not do that, etc. And problems arise with the changing perception of the role of the state, especially in economic spheres. I mentioned to you in the previous lectures that in the pre-1947 period, the Indian administration was indeed a bureaucratic state, as the government was identified with bureaucracy because the high officials, members of the Indian civil service and other services, enjoyed not only executive, but sometimes even legislative powers. Amazing. When an IAS officer was appointed as the governor, he had the power to set aside the laws passed by the legislature. The governor under 1935 Act has the discretionary powers to direct the cabinet to do this or that. The members of the ICAS were directly answerable to the governor because the governor was very often a part of their fraternity, a member of the same group. And even after provincial autonomy was granted, this situation continued. Now, after 1991 reforms in India, there has to be a complete change in the mindset and approach of the officials, especially those who are involved in economic administration and those whose job is to provide support to economic growth of this country, which means practically everyone. Okay? If I want to start a factory in Gurgaon, right from Haryana Development Authority, starting from allotment of land, right up to electricity board for power, then issue of licenses, etc., permissions, single window clearance from the Ministry of Finance, etc. So whole system is really geared to assist them. Now, this requires a change of administrative culture from being rule-bound to a flexible problem-solving attitude. And this is basically what is expected of the administration, as civil servants have to function in certain areas particularly more as facilitators and less as regulators. The point here is very interesting. As, say, a person involved in industrial development activities in a state or in the center, your job is not merely to help him to get through the processes which are your departmental work, but also to help him to get clearance from other sources. So he might be asked to speak to the electricity board or such other agencies, municipalities, corporations, or whatever. And this particular role is extremely important, and what is called proactive role or a role of a facilitator might be misinterpreted as an act of undue favor. Now the line is very thin. So there is a dilemma. This dilemma has been noticed recently in a number of cases. You all know about it, and therefore there is a problem of defining work culture in general terms. What I am trying to say is that work culture varies from department to department, from work to work. Your approach has to be tailored to meet the objects of the department. So this definition of work culture is what you might even call a dynamic concept of work culture. But mind you, when you are involved, a civil servant is involved in a regulatory kind of work, he cannot bypass rules. He cannot overlook precedents. He has to take a decision considering that he is exercising power under a particular law. And if this particular law does not provide for exemptions, he has no option but to go by the law. So this fine-tuning, balancing act, tightrope walking, whatever you might say, is a necessary part of administrative culture, the work culture of the civil servant. And therefore, this has meant really very different professional demands. What I mean is that different skills are required to discharge these functions. Sometimes a combination of different skills. You see, if suppose you are heading a department for promoting industries, you need to have not merely knowledge of industrial policies, practices, and systems, but at the same time, you must also know the laws, rules, and regulations which are impacting on the setting up of industries. But I have observed that in the process, several cultures have developed in the bureaucracy. Say, the culture of a person, a civil servant, who has worked throughout his life in the Ministry of Home, went back to the state, he becomes Home Commissioner or Home Secretary. It deals with regulatory matters. If he has not worked, say, in a responsible position in other ministries, his approach would be, I found, very different from the approach of a person who has had the experience of working in development ministries. Now, I'm not saying which is superior or which is inferior. No, I'm only saying that in the process, different cultures are evident in the country, associated with the peculiar workload or nature of the work of a particular ministry. Okay? Are you with me on this point of different cultures? I mentioned about Lord Snow yesterday, his novel, The Corridors of Power. Snow had delivered in 1968 a lecture on an interesting subject, Two Cultures. You might download it in the internet, go through it. This was an epoch-making lecture where he talked about the culture of humanities and the culture of science, and how these two cultures are not in talking terms with each other. It was a path-breaking lecture. What I see now in India, the emergence of different work cultures in different spheres of government activities. This needs study, and all I could say is that every discipline requires a certain effort to master it, right? Finance, for example, is a regulatory department. Finance cannot be flexible because your decision creates a precedent. The precedents are important in administration. Now, I come to a somewhat hilarious aspect of the whole matter, in my personal opinion, of the perception of the people in the media, perception of the media or the perception of the bureaucracy in the media. Denigrating bureaucracy does no good to the state or to the institutions of governance. Now, I find it appalling that in the media, particularly here, the senior officials are referred to as babus. Did you ever think of it before you decided to appear for the examination, that you are really trying to become what in the media perception, babudam? Okay? And I found it personally pretty disgusting. Why? As a person coming from Eastern India, I know the word babu is an honorific term. You see, it is used to address in a respectable manner to a person who is your elder, like that. Babu Rajendra Prasad. Rajan Babu was always Rajan Babu. Vijayananda Patnaik, when he was chief minister, was Biju Babu. Even now in Orissa, Naveen Patnaik is addressed by the people as Naveen Babu in a respectable manner. And may I just tell you something pretty interesting and somewhat hilarious. You see, I worked in government of Assam. They have a civil list. I went through the old civil list of the government of Assam. If you are a Bengali Hindu gazetted officer, you will be notified as Babu so-and-so. If you are an Assamese Hindu, you will be notified as Srijut, S-R-I-J-U-T, to indicate the subtle distinction between the two communities. If you are a Muslim, whether Assamese or Bengali, regardless of your knowledge of Arabic, you will be a Maulavi. Maulavi so and so. The gentleman may not know anything about Arabic, but he is a Maulavi. because he's a Muslim. Okay. Fourth, but there's an interesting thing. An Englishman or an Anglo-Indian will be Mr. However, if a Hindu or a Muslim of the state who joined the state civil service but happened to be a graduate of a British university, London or anything, he will be Mr. He will be elevated to the status of Mr. All ICS officers, regardless of their ethnic or social origin, will be Mr. Why? Because every member of the Indian civil service is equal. So the British concept of equality before law, equal treatment of everyone, had put them in this category. Now, all zamindars were addressed officially as babus. Babu so-and-so, zamindar of so-and-so place. Now, I really find that this term is being used here in a kind of derogatory sense to mean slothful, rule-bound, rigid and insensitive civil servants. And what is more shocking is that regardless of their ranks, everyone is a babu, whether you are in a higher position or in a lower position. Now, this is, I think, unhistorical and does no justice to the work that is being done by the civil servants. One must recall that the members of the ICS were referred to as the civilians. You are an Assam civilian or a Bengal civilian or a UP civilian or a Punjab civilian, not as anything else. Why this is no longer so is a matter to ponder about, as it affects the moral and self-esteem of the civil service. And thus governance, neither Plato nor Chanakya nor Aristotle would have approved such description of officials. Therefore, to bring about a change in the image of the civil servants is therefore necessary. And one must make conscious effort to highlight this aspect. Let us remember one aspect. Why is civil service so important? You see, the structure of governance that we had during foreign rule, whatever may be the nature of the foreign rule. You see, one redeeming feature of foreign rule is that the strategic posts, you understand what I mean by strategic posts of governance, are always the close reserve of the ruling ethnic group. It is not open to be ruled. In a foreign rule, all top posts are reserved, are open only to people who belong to the ruling foreign elite. The British rule was no exception. Till 1935, or say rather till 1922-23, I could go back only to 1922-23. Indian ICS officers were not allowed, is too harsh a word, were not expected to be a part of what was called foreign and political department. Indians were not taken. Indian ICS officers were allowed to work in the states, etc., but these posts were reserved for them. Secondly, till independence, the chief secretaries to the government of provinces were all Europeans. No Indian was allowed to hold the post of the chief secretary. The inspector general of police, most states were Europeans. Why? Because these are the strategic posts of the government, and only towards the end of 1920s, when the British decided that they might have to pack up, so they started allowing Indians in the foreign and political department, in the home department, and also in core group of the finance ministry. Finance was the first department which was Indianized. Why? Because the Indians were good at mathematics, arithmetic, calculations, rules, regulations. So gradually they allowed Indians to get into non-strategic but equally important areas. So what I am trying to say is that to describe the entire bureaucracy, including those who are involved in strategic decision making for the country, is absolutely unfair and betrays lack of understanding of how governments function. I've tried to interact with some of my friends who are working in other governments, whether such a term exists anywhere in the world. Not any place, nowhere. This is a peculiar Indian phenomena, and this is a perpetuation of this kind of appellations and description of the civil servants is something that should not be allowed to continue, and a public opinion should be created gradually to remove this, and only civil servants could do it by their good work. It is not that the good work is not appreciated, but somehow this kind of a derogatory description seems to persist. Now we come to what is work culture. What are the components of the work culture? Some of these have been covered already. I'll quickly run through it. Punctuality, strict observance of the conduct expected of a civil servant during office hours. This is very important. Now, one psychological problem that you all faced, you see, which would require some training, a serious training, but at the same time it's a kind of self-assessment which is required. When you are posted, please see the notice board, the office of so-and-so. You are holding that office. The invitation that comes to you, not to you as an individual, it is really to the office. And one should not feel mighty great. Everything that comes to you, you are a subdivisional officer, you are asked to preside over the governing body of a local college. The principals may be of your father's age. The professors are all senior to you. It is not that you, as Mr. X, is appointed as chairman. No, it is your office. So this means that maintaining the dignity of the office is the first and the foremost responsibility, and this is the first part, element, ingredient of the work culture. Now, second is thorough knowledge of laws, rules, regulations, bylaws, and executive orders covering the subjects entrusted to a civil servant, and a positive attitude to learn, refresh, and update such knowledge. A system of periodic in-service training is necessary to create such competence, which alone could give confidence to civil servants in doing their work and thus acquire self-esteem. Now, this is extremely important. Now, you might have been, say, a very good tennis player. You might have been a good ghazal singer. You might have other qualities. I read in the account of a British IAS officer, he was telling his junior that you are a great shot, you are a fine sportsman, you go and kill tigers here and there. In those days, this was written in 1920s. But mind you, please just keep your eyes and ears open. If people talk about you only as a great, shot, you have a problem. So one must understand, master the job, to be able to establish a professional footprint. I use this word deliberately, professional footprint, in terms of improving the systems, in terms of improving the delivery of the service, and in terms of a better relations to the people, and in the process you create a better image of your office. Which means you are the office personified, but you're not distinct from the office. As long as you hold that post, you are a part of this office. You are indistinguishable. You cannot be separated. The next quality follows from the second one. Willingness to study case history, precedents, court orders, and background of any matter which comes up for a decision. For field officers, interest in local history, cultures, traditions, and languages are essential professional requirements which require cultivation of a wide reading habit. This is self-explanatory. Next, free from any bias, prejudice, or preconceived notions about any matter, group, or community, as expression of such sentiments is bound to give rise to a kind of trust deficit in the minds of some people in the area, and apprehension among the citizens that could be hard to change because the people expect civil servants to be just, fair, and impartial, and persons with integrity and empathy for the public, regardless of caste, creed, or ethnicity. This means, as I said, thou shalt not open your mouth unnecessarily. See, there is a problem here for civil servants, and when you join service, you have been warned by your superiors. In fact, the first point that I mentioned was told to me by my mentor when I was in Mizoram. He said, look, when you go there as SDO, there will be a lot of invitations. For heaven's sake, don't think that you are personally being invited. No. You hold the office. Because you happen to sit on the chair, you are getting all these invitations to inaugurate this, to inaugurate that, to attend this function or that function. Remember, they are not looking at you. But you have to maintain the dignity of the office that you happen to hold. That's the most important. This is a part of the work culture. Next is a flair for writing precise orders and notes without the aid of the subordinates. This is very important. You see, what happens that once you go and hold any position in the civil service, you get a different picture of the Aam Aadmi. Don't quote me. You see, it is fine that the people are always the main actors in a democracy. You know, you have to be people-centric, community-friendly, etc., etc. But these are in general terms. What happens in day-to-day life? The first problem that the civil servant faces, he is exposed to flattery. Flattery is an Indian art, very subtle. For instance, you have joined, say, in the income tax department. The lawyer will come and make a submission and say, sir, your knowledge of income tax law is phenomenal. In my entire practice here, I have not come across any officer who is so well conversant with laws, rules and regulations. For heaven's sake, don't believe in these statements. These are basically designed to cultivate you. Similarly, you will come across such people. Very soon their opinions may change, but one must guard against this kind of situation. And here it's very important that you are on the top of the hierarchy. Okay? When you join, you are already having a supervisory role. You have two roles. One, you have powers to exercise under the particular law. Second, you have people to assist you in doing so. It's not a one-man's job, you see. Now, there will be always in your office some people who have been there for donkey's years, who have been there for many, many years, and they know probably more about it. And they might come and tell you, sir, these are the precedents, this is etc., etc. If you agree immediately, he will go around tell people to maine ye kaam karwa diya. Ye karwa liya. I have got it done. Now, therefore, it all stands to reason that you must try to create an impression and establish a reputation of being able to decide on your own. No doubt, you take into account the views of your subordinates. You are duty bound. They are also paid, mind you. There is an interesting book, Good English, How to Write It. It is I think Valence is the author. You see, English Language Book Society has published a large number of books. Here, there was an incident of an Indian British officer who got a letter from another district officer, also an European. He was very unhappy. So he called up his friend. He said, "Why did you write this?" He said, "Actually, I did not write it. My head clerk had written it. I have signed it." He said, "What do I do with it?" He said, "You are also a head clerk. You ask him to give a suitable reply and you do it. This is not the way things should be done. In a jocular manner, in a lighter vein, this is fine. What is important here is that whatever is submitted before you, you should study it, take little of your time, but give a clear impression, create a clear impression that the judgment is yours. This is your decision. Others who are behind you have been paid to assist you, to bring to your notice all the facts and circumstances, but decision is yours. Once you create this decision, nobody will talk about you being a good tennis player or a good shikari or this or that. They will talk about your capacity as an officer, and that is what ultimately is most important. Now, this exercise of writing orders, passing judgments, is something that requires cultivation of reading habits and studying some serious essays, some novels, etc. I cannot suggest, but it is only reading which can perfect your articulation skill in writing. And in the government, articulation in writing is a prized virtue. It is noted. Next is moderation in public speech, personal behavior, avoidance of any, even remotely disparaging remark about any community, and careful dealing with media, and development of an attitude of not succumbing to temptation of self-publicity suggests a low-profile image as conducive to efficient discharge of functions. Now, this requires cultivation of certain traits. It is a part of what is called character building. Next point is visible sympathy for the subordinate staff and willingness to protect their morale and stand by them by assuming responsibility. Actually, the word responsibility is dropped here. By assuming responsibility is okay, it is there. Assuming in appropriate cases responsibility for their actions purported to have been done under his or her orders. This is the quality that the civil servants must acquire, must cultivate, that you have to stand by your subordinates. If somebody is met with an accident or his wife is terribly ill, and if you have means to support, to help him, by all means do that. You earn the confidence. Why it is necessary is that ultimately you have to have leadership quality, and the leadership quality is best reflected in times of crisis. I want to add one point here, that innovations designed to improve functioning of the system by ensuring greater accountability with some technical knowledge that most of you do possess now. I'm very happy to say that many of the officers recently, recruited to various cadres have shown remarkable capacity to improve and bring to the organization their knowledge of, say, computer-based administration, their knowledge of better dealing with cases, expeditious disposal of matters like that. So see what innovations you could bring. There is always a scope for introducing innovations in the system. So broadly, these are the qualities expected of you. And objective of a civil servant would be to go by Vivekananda's dictum. Everyone born must try to leave some good work as his or her mark in whatever field he or she was destined. In other words, he said, leave your footprint. Since you are born as a man, leave your footprint on the sands of time by your good work. That should be the, you can say, the objective of the work culture that a civil servant has to develop. So I've completed this portion of what is called work culture. I'll take up now transparency and citizens charter. Is there any question on this segment of work culture? No? You agree with it? What about lady officers? This is an important issue, that lady officers in the field, in all departments, face certain problems, despite whatever we say. Now, I have seen some outstanding lady officers. I worked under them, and I found that they excel because of one reason: professional competency. Men are afraid of, by and large, men are afraid of lady officers who know their job very well. I had worked under a lady officer who was divisional commissioner, and she was feared as much as she was respected because of her thorough knowledge of rules, regulations, and her capacity for taking prompt decisions and being very impartial. One quality that she had, which I should have mentioned, is that appreciate the good work as well as before reprimanding, try to improve him. This lady officer that I mentioned, I got a letter from her that you have done very well. Soon enough, another letter came that you have not done very well. So she spoke to me and said, you see, this you got, you put 2 plus 2, don't bother, this is a part of the game. My job is to see that you are on the straight path. You are on the path of efficiency. So this particular trait of lady officers, impartiality. Impartiality is remarkable. Efficiency, impartiality, and objectivity should be essential part of the work culture of a lady officer. We come to transparency in government, Right to Information Act, Citizens Charter, and quality of service delivery. What I want to suggest is that you may like to give a cursory glance at the Official Secrets Act that was enacted during the British period, and whatever has been done thereafter, especially the Right to Information Act and the limitations of this act. There are certain orders of the courts. It will be also interesting to go through the National Green Tribunal Act, NGT, which has been recently set up by the government to deal with environment-related cases. What I'm saying is that this has direct impact on the governance, in the sense that NGT can entertain a petition about, say, pollution of river Yamuna, or construction of lands, construction of buildings on the flood plains of river Yamuna. Okay? Now, this has a direct bearing on the district administration. Similarly, construction of a transmission line going through the forest area attracts provisions of the Environment Act. You need to go through a certain process. So, once you go through this system, you will see that in the Environment Law Administration of India, public consultation with the public, recording their views has been an important part of the legislation. This is indirectly connected with opening up the system and its functioning to public scrutiny. It has led to environmental activism as well as RTI activism. So, what is necessary in these matters is that it is not just getting the information, but what is important is making use of the information. What use are you making of the information? One is that it imposes some kind of a check on the administration. But at the same time, what is important is that it brings the matter into public domain. I have got circulated a guide to environmental public hearing, which if you read, you get to see how transparency laws of India are moving, and now it is covering environment. Maybe some days it might cover education, it might cover so many other aspects. But the principles are that the system should be increasingly open to public and social scrutiny. This makes social audit a very, very important part of our efforts to make the system transparent and proper. When I'm saying proper is that propriety of the decision making is important. It is not enough that it is transparent, but transparencies must lead to propriety of decision. You see, otherwise it has no meaning. If things remain as they are, then you only get to know how the system should not function, or it is not functioning. But if it leads to improvement of the decision-making process, and therefore appropriate decisions become the outcome of this process, the objectives of these laws will be fully realized. Now, therefore, there is a scope for a advocacy role. You know, this advocacy role is different from the normal advocacy work in courts. It is a social advocacy role. The social advocacy role is to be played by the civil society organizations, and the Administrative Reforms Commission made a specific recommendation that state should encourage growth of voluntary organizations to ensure a larger participation of the people in the decision-making process, and also participatory form of government. Apart from the local self-government institutions, if you have active social groups, civil society groups, it would help towards better administration of laws. This is a subject which is very much in the public domain. I was somewhat involved in drafting the national policy on the voluntary sector in the Planning Commission in 2003-04, 2002 and 3 particularly, and the government followed a process of consultation with all stakeholders, eventually drafted a policy. Next government which came picked it up, again had gone through a motion of consultations, consultation with the states, consultation with the stakeholders, and finally the national policy on the voluntary sector was made in the year 2007. I suggest you download that policy. You will see that the objective of the policy was to create an enabling environment for the voluntary organizations to grow to diversify, specialize on matters connected with welfare of the people. In other words, the government was keen to promote growth of voluntary sector all over, in all spheres, and also the policy contains a provision that rules, regulations dealing with accessing funds, domestic as well as foreign, by these organizations should be liberalized. But it did not happen. But the policy remains in the public domain, but it recognizes the important role assigned to the civil society groups in implementation of various programs, policies, and also, more importantly, perhaps a partnership role has been envisaged with the government. Many programs in the health ministry, for example, are implemented through what we call NGOs. And these NGOs are also classified. Some are called mother NGOs, in the sense they help smaller NGOs to come up, provide them training and other facilities. So, RTI Act and the policy on voluntary sector, the local self-government institutions like Panchayati Raj essentially have the same kind of social development agenda and must work in close cooperation with each other. It is not a turf separate for the RTI or environment. No, all these have to converge, and convergence is what gives strength to democracy. In the same manner, citizens' charter is an improvement, in the sense that the Bhagidari concept of urban governance in Delhi lays down the rights of the citizens. Rights of the citizen to get certain services from the government and other agencies. And these are rights which, though not justiciable, in the sense you can't go to a court and file a case that my garbage in that area is not being removed, but it gives an important voice. And urban governance through the Resident Welfare Association, for example, RWES, really suggests introduction of democracy at the mahalla level, at the locality level. So together with RTI, Bhagidari, and municipal governance, what is called Nagar Palikas under the 74th Amendment, should mean deepening of democracy at the grassroots levels. So one must appreciate that such actions on the part of civil society groups, associations, are essentially designed to assist the authorities to provide better service and to fix local priorities. So democracy essentially means expansion of such associations. I quoted from Alexis de Tocqueville yesterday. I repeated here, the real strength of the American democracy is their natural inclination to form associations. Therefore, Citizens Charter, RTI Act, Bhagidari concept, local self-government are institutional expressions of such broadening and deepening of democracy. So, the conclusion is, stronger the civil society movements, greater will be the degree of transparency in governance. This completes my assessment of the subjects listed here, other than the last two, which we'll take up tomorrow. If you have any question, I'll be delighted to respond. No question? Okay, then I would suggest for your reading another interesting book which I have read some time back, The Revenge of Geography. Title of this book, The Revenge of Geography by Robert Kaplan, Kaplan. Why I am suggesting this book, apart from the fact that it is written in a wonderful readable style. Robert Kaplan is a respected journalist who worked for New York Times. He had written a couple of books, all equally, interesting. Here, Kaplan has looked at geography from the point of view of a social scientist and a strategic thinker. It is relevant for understanding some of the issues that are included in your general studies segment. He said, for instance, I quote, "Mutation of geography needs careful scientific assessment." River linking project that we are talking about, he refers to it and said, environment impact of river linking, ecological impact must be seriously considered. He said that hydroelectric project is a mutation of geography, and therefore has been known to produce adverse consequences in the lower region and in the catchment area. What I found most interesting in his book is the theory of geographical determinism. Very interesting. He says that geography determines not only your economic future, but also your political future. Because you can't choose your neighbors. You cannot choose your neighbors. Neighbors are there. You have got to live with them. And he concludes, topography and demography determine the political power and defense needs of people. There are numerous examples. I try to apply this to the Indian context. Delta, a delta is hard to divide. In the entire history of recent times, only one delta has been politically divided. That is Bengal. And it is very difficult. When I was working with the government of Assam, I had a chance to see the construction of fencing along the Indo-Bangladesh border. There are special geographical problems associated with economic growth of every country. If you go through Kaplan, apart from it is highly informative, you will get some insights about management of natural resources. Essentially, this is what it boils down to. That, you see, the idea of a state is that this is your area, you are the monarch of all that you survey. But it is not so. Climate change is a phenomena which affects a large area. So your action in dealing with your own natural resources produces an effect that goes beyond your boundaries. These are some of the issues which I'm sure if you go through it will stand you in good state in dealing with the complex subjects that you will be handling in your general studies segment. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I enjoyed talking to you.